Today on The Nation Speaks, Unmasking Antifa and what's wrong in the state of California. Hello and welcome to The Nation Speaks. I'm your host, Cindy Drucare. How much do you know about Antifa? It's likely you know it's short for anti-fascist, but who are Antifa and what exactly do they want? Some describe Antifa as an ideology, not an organization, or at best, a loose network of anti-racists, some of whom are violent. By contrast, last May, when deadly riots first broke out across the country in the wake of George Floyd's death in police custody, then Attorney General William Barr said Antifa instigated that violence, and he called it domestic terrorism. President Donald Trump also called for Antifa to be designated a domestic terrorist group. There's one very brave journalist who's reported up close on the activities of Antifa for about 5 years. He's gone undercover into Antifa-occupied zones, and he was beaten almost to death by Antifa members. And now he's written probably the most authoritative book on the subject, which answers a lot of questions about what Antifa is and what its goals are. And joining us is Andy Ngo. He's a journalist and author of the recent book Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. Andy, welcome.
Thank you.
Your book is just recently out. There's a lot in there, and we're going to get to some of it. But I'm wondering if, as has been the case, the Antifa riots and Antifa violence in different parts of the country, especially the Pacific Northwest, is not covered a lot in the mainstream media. Can you tell us what's going on right now?
Yeah, so the issues of kind of like not proper coverage of what's happening in the Pacific Northwest isn't just a current issue. It's been going on for years. DC, New York is like a whole nother world away from what's happening in Portland and Seattle. But there was this perception that after Biden had won or was announced to be the winner in November, that this would mean that Antifa would fade away, that they didn't have anything to riot over. I knew that to be a wrong analysis right away. They rioted in Portland, for example, on the 4th of November. There's been around a dozen riots in Portland and Seattle since then. On the day that Biden was inaugurated, in Portland, they actually destroyed the headquarters of the Oregon Democrat Party. And in Seattle, there were some riots as well. One of the banners they held in Portland said, "We don't want Biden, we want revenge." So this is a violent extremist movement that uses any excuse to carry out acts of carnage and violence. So in 2016 and for going on to 2020, they have a convenient excuse in that they said they were opposing American fascism because of what they said was the Trump regime. That was always just a pretext for them to cause misery and carry out homicides and attacks. Now they say that they're just opposing America itself, because America upholds systems of fascism that is interlinked with white supremacy and racism.
So in your book, you try to clarify some misconceptions about Antifa, and one of them is that, they've been described as the paramilitary wing of the Democrats, but clearly, as you've just been describing, that's not the case. Why do you think there's such a wide misunderstanding of what they're really about?
So this perception that they are closely linked with the Democrat Party, I understand where that comes from. And there's actually, even though it's not an accurate statement, there's reasons for why people have that misconception. One thing is that, so Antifa has existed on the fringes of the far left in the United States really since about the 80s. But they were able to occupy space in the mainstream left with the help of Democrats from 2016 onwards, in that both of them had a shared mutual enemy in Trump, and both of them were using irresponsible language and talking points about how this was ascendant American fascism, that we were on the cusp of another Holocaust. So it gave an opening for Antifa to move in, because on the surface, Antifa will say they're just anti-fascists and they're out to oppose white supremacy and neo-Nazis. But what I was witnessing on the ground in my home city of Portland, the epicenter of American Antifa, is that they were carrying out indiscriminate acts of violence, not just against property, but against people. And it kept continuing to escalate and escalate. And it was becoming embedded in Portland. It was becoming routine for us to have just political violence on the streets, brawls for over a number of years. And then in 2020, they exploited the death of George Floyd to carry out acts of carnage, not just in Portland, but in dozens of other American cities, where they literally burnt down neighborhoods to the ground, destroyed numerous lives, destroyed livelihoods. There were several dozen deaths that were associated to the riots that happened. And all throughout this, the response from those in the Democrat Party was to praise the actions of these extremists.
So do you think that those in the Democrat Party that were praising the acts, that they just have fundamentally misunderstood what Antifa is really about?
Yes, for the most part. And that's because the mainstream media have not done a very good job in explaining what Antifa actually are. In fact, if you look at most of the headlines on Antifa going for the past 4.5 years, you'll see them described as anti-fascist protesters opposing racists and the far right and white supremacists. On all these things, it sounds very noble, and it makes people want to get on board with that because that sounds entirely reasonable. But then, as I write in my book, you dive into the ideology of Antifa, and you look at their literature, you look at the thinkers that they look up to, and the texts that form the basis of tenets of their ideology. You see very clearly that these are anarchist communists, and they don't actually deny that either. That's what they call for. So they're calling, when they talk about wanting to burn down the system, they do mean it literally. They want to destroy the United States, and not just destroying the nation state, but actually all its founding ideals. They view, for example, property rights and freedom of expression and other important founding ideas that make up the American philosophy as vectors for fascism. And so they are trying to create a utopia where there are no governments, there are no states, and all you have are communes where people take care of one another. And this sounds all theoretical, but in 2020, they were actually given the opportunity to do so. In Seattle, in the largest city in the Pacific Northwest, they actually took over 6 blocks of city property and established what they called an autonomous zone. They had signs up for their hard border that said, "You are now leaving the United States." They had their own guards carrying weapons who were at these checkpoints. And the city allowed it to go on for 3 weeks. And it was an experiment in anarchy and chaos that led to several deaths and multiple shootings, attempted rapes, and the livelihoods of everybody who was essentially held hostage in this area. Their livelihoods were destroyed because the businesses were severely damaged. People avoided it because it wasn't safe. But if you went on CNN at that time, what you were hearing from the mayor of Seattle was, "This could be a summer of love." And if you just listen to journalists like Chris Cuomo or Don Lemon, they're describing Antifa as comparable to American soldiers liberating Europe from fascism.
Okay, so there's about 3 different things I want to ask you based on all of that. The first one, one of the biggest impressions I had from reading your book is this whitewashing and this just general lack of appreciation for how organized Antifa actually is. We hear, it's just an idea, it's not a movement or something like that. But they're actually extremely well organized. And you talked about, literature that they're reading. Can you just give us a picture of that to explain to people what that means?
Yeah, so in my book, I published for the first time some of these primary documents that were leaked to me by somebody who actually went through the membership process for Rose City Antifa, which is the Antifa cell in Portland. And you'll see that there's actually a curriculum that is published in the book verbatim as it was implemented with their so-called students. And what needs to be stated is that the process of indoctrination is long and extensive. It's going literally months. And every week there are assigned readings, and they meet in secret. And in addition to the readings, which introduce them to ideas about why it's important to break windows on businesses and buildings and all that. They provided an ideological argument for that. They view it as an attack on capitalism, for one. There's also pamphlets about how to make homemade weapons. Part of the curriculum included training them how to use guns and how to shoot. So this is domestic terrorism behind the curtains. And on the surface, it does kind of look like they're not very well organized and all that. But just look at the carnage that they've been able to carry out regionally in the Pacific Northwest last year. We had months on end of nightly riots. So maybe to put this into context for people who are watching now, so what happened on the 6th of January in the Capitol, that type of violence. So all that and worse occurred night after night in my home city. And they were trying to burn down a US federal courthouse in downtown. So they came with things like explosives. They had riot gears that they were disseminating to their comrades and members. They had sources of funding. All of this I write about in the book, and I'm extremely disappointed that the federal authorities from the previous administration didn't seem to initiate the investigations to begin to break up some of these networks, because they are connected to one another as autonomous affinity groups, but they are connected to one another using Telegram and other encrypted channels of communication like Signal. So you can actually think of them very similar to how jihadists will organize as well.
Right, and so the attention that you would have expected all of that to get is nothing near the attention, the January 6th Capitol riots seem to be getting since then.
You can look at what happens when they gain power. So let's look at Chaz, or you can look at the autonomous zone they established in Portland for a week in December. Even though they say that they are establishing a government-free area, an area with no laws, in the power vacuum, those who are most brutal and most vicious and most willing to use violence are the ones who rise up to claim power. That's exactly what happened in Chaz. And the way that they were solving conflicts was through violence. There are fights that were breaking out all the time in Chaz. But if the headlines that I was reading from, let's say, the Daily Beast and other places without, this was just a peaceful block party atmosphere.
And as you describe that, the ones who are most willing to do violence are the ones that rise to the top. It's exactly what we see in communist China and any communist regime. It's exactly why they become so brutal, because those are the people who are rewarded. So we talk a lot about they are doing this, they are doing that. From your close monitoring and interacting with Antifa, who are they? Who are the people wearing the black? What do you know about them?
One of the projects that I was doing as part of my research for Unmasked was looking into the backgrounds of every single person who was arrested in Portland. Portland stood out just because the riots went on for so long that it provided actually a very large data set of arrestees. So I was looking at things such as demographics, but also backgrounds into who these people are. And perhaps unsurprisingly to a lot of people, many of the people getting arrested at the riots are in white-collar professions, such as academia, journalism. Some of them were attorneys, people who you think wouldn't be engaging in extremist political violence, but yet they were. But then there was also another side of Antifa, which involves people who are extremely vulnerable, those who are vagrants, homeless, dealing with mental health issues. And I noticed that the system that Antifa had set up in Portland included, in addition to the protests and riots, also this community aspect of where they were providing for one another, telling everybody that you don't need the state to take care of you. We can take care of you. So they set up these, what they called mutual aid, and they had stations that provided food, supplies, and various resources. So it brought in actually a lot of homeless people to their camps, you could say, the areas that they set up of the operations. And then these people were given riot gear and told and instructed to participate in the violence. So these are usually the people who are first victimized and getting arrested and all that, and getting injured or getting charged. And the people who are pulling the strings in the background, such as those who are making homemade weapons and homemade IEDs and giving them out and passing them out to people, those people don't get apprehended. So I have a certain amount of sympathy for the people that are victimized because they're pulled into this extremist ideology and used as fodder for a larger political agenda. And so this is what we have to recognize about Antifa, is that unfortunately it has quite wide appeal to people, particularly people who are educated, actually, because the ideologies and the theories, the theoretical frameworks that form the basis of the ideologies are based off of historical thinkers, anarchists and communist thinkers. And so it does appeal to those who are educated. So we shouldn't be surprised that some of the people who have been either convicted or accused of being part of Antifa violence have been academics, actually.
Wow, that's very interesting. We're just about out of time, but I want to ask one other thing about the connection between Antifa and BLM, especially because BLM has just been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. Can you comment on the connection between the two?
It does feel like we're through the looking glass, aren't we? That a revolutionary Marxist organization like BLM could be praised as doing peace in the world. When if you go to their events and you listen to the speakers that they have, you look at the figures that the leaders venerate, they venerate murderers, such as Assata Shakur. She was a Black revolutionary Marxist in the 70s who was convicted in the murder of a state trooper, and then she fled to Cuba where she got asylum. It's just the relationship between BLM and Antifa is in that ultimately they have differing goals. BLM is very sort of in the traditional revolutionary Marxist perspective, worldview, whereas Antifa has elements of anarchism in addition to communism. So right now they have a shared mutual enemy in the United States and the American philosophy. So they partnered together, which is why if you go to BLM events, frequently you will see Antifa act as volunteer security. Chaz was this union project between BLM and Antifa, and they mutually cross-pollinate. Antifa is making BLM more tolerant of open violence, whereas BLM is introducing ideologies or theories such as critical race theory and intersectionality to Antifa. So they're mutually reinforcing one another and radicalizing one another.
Very interesting. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us today, and good luck with the book.
Thank you.
And the police, of course, are also forced to confront the reality of Antifa. And it's a complicated battleground. Many patrol cars and at least 2 police stations have been burned down. Officers themselves have been under serious attack, both rhetorically and physically. Community relations have suffered. The National Police Association is a nonprofit that works to counter these trends by supporting police and educating law enforcement supporters in how they can help police departments accomplish their goals. And joining us now for the police perspective on Antifa is Sergeant Betsy Smith. She's a spokesperson for the National Police Association. Sergeant Smith, welcome.
Thank you so very much.
So can you explain from a police perspective, how do you characterize Antifa?
I was a police officer for 29 years. I dealt with Antifa 20 years ago. They were the anarchists. They were the reclaim the streets people. And they were, they hooked up with Occupy Wall Street. And in a post-Ferguson era, in around 2014, they kind of latched themselves onto the Black Lives Matter movement. And now you fast forward to the George Floyd situation, and last summer, they have become increasingly mobile, increasingly violent, and they are very problematic, not just in the Northwest, Portland and Seattle, where people are used to hearing about them, but throughout the nation, and even down into Texas and west into California, and of course, east into Washington, D.C. And I would label them as a terrorist organization, a domestic terrorist organization.
What % do we see in media reports of the activity that they're actually perpetrating?
It's a very low percentage. A great example is the night of Joe Biden's inauguration. There were very violent protests, Antifa protests, riots, if you will, in Portland and in Seattle. Most people had no idea that had occurred because the media very much gives them a pass.
It might be confusing to a lot of people or distressing to see areas where the police haven't been able to protect property and citizens, where police precincts, were actually taken over by Antifa in Seattle and Minneapolis. Why? Can you explain that dynamic for us and explain how that happens?
Well, sure. An excellent example is what happened in the city of Minneapolis immediately post George Floyd's video being presented nationwide. Those Minneapolis police officers were ill prepared because their leadership left them ill prepared. I have talked to many Minneapolis police officers who were forced to watch as the 3rd precinct burned down. They were forced to abandon their building. And when we see, the looting, and people look at that and say, why aren't the police doing something? There's 2 main reasons. One is because they were told to stand down and not do anything. And number 2, because they are left unprepared.
So what would make them prepared? What would that look like?
Well, when Antifa shows up, when any sort of violent protest shows up, and when you talk about Antifa, you also have to talk about the violent arm of Black Lives Matter. They don't necessarily show up in secret. There's lots of planning. So we have to have enough people in place, and they've got to have those resources in place. But those officers have to be physically prepared with the right equipment. This past summer in Chicago, for example, you had Chicago police officers fighting a violent Black Lives Matter / Antifa crowd. The only helmets any of the officers had were their bicycle helmets, and they were getting frozen water bottles lobbed at them, fireworks. People had lasers, which hundreds of police officers have had their eyes damaged by lasers. And they are left without the necessary equipment to be able to protect themselves and protect those businesses and statues and things like that. And a lot of the reason for that is because a lot of that equipment has been deemed militarized. And now we're seeing a movement where the federal government, with an executive order by Joe Biden, we're not going to be able to obtain some of that quote unquote militarized equipment, those vehicles and things like that keep those officers safe while they're trying to protect small businesses.
So what's been the impact of police community relations in cities or communities where Antifa is very active?
Well, it's extremely difficult. These officers are presented as the bad guys, and Antifa presents itself very often with help from the media and from local politicians. Antifa presents itself as the anti-fascist. In other words, they say that the police are the fascists and they are there to protect people from those fascists. In reality, Antifa are the fascists. Law enforcement is caught in the middle. People who own small businesses who believe in law and order, they're afraid to speak up because Antifa they're not only violent during their riots, but they also can be violent behind the scenes, and they dox people, and they will show up at a police officer's home. We've had Antifa scream to officers on a violent riot line that your wife should be raped and we hope your children die and we're going to come to your house and murder your children. I mean, it's abhorrent behavior.
Wow, that's really distressing to hear. So how is morale in general among police forces across the nation right now?
Well, one of the things the National Police Association has been talking about is the rise in police officer suicide. It's extremely distressing. It's caught a little bit of national attention just in the last week or so because we had 2 Capitol police officers commit suicide. And police officer suicide is nothing new to us. American law enforcement officers die twice as often by their own hand as they do by felonious assault. That's just an unheard of statistic. We had about 175 American police officers commit suicide last year. We've had at least 20 this year in 2021, 8 in the last week. It's all around the country. And part of it in this last year is because American law enforcement is being vilified.
And speaking of being vilified, and just noticing the thin blue line flag behind you, and even that symbol has been, vilified.
There are multiple police chiefs who are banning the thin blue line flag from their roll call rooms and from their patrol vehicles and from their uniforms. And it is demoralizing. That flag represents our profession, and it especially represents the sacrifice of our fallen. It has nothing to do with race. It's not a symbol of white supremacy. Again, and it's been around for decades.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us today, Sergeant Smith, and good luck with your work.
Thank you so much.
Coming up after the break, what are people so upset about in California? But first, here's America Q&A.
Antifa, from what I understand, means anti-fascism. In general, being anti-fascism is a good thing. But the way to be anti-fascist is to not go around and destroy homes and destroy businesses and destroy lives.
This democracy is good like it is. They need to just deal with the process and let the process work itself out.
I don't have a very specific answer, but I mean, as a whole, I approve of it.
Hot issue for the world right now. Anything and everything you hear on the news right now is negative. I'm sure whatever Antifa is doing, I'm sure in their minds, they're trying to be positive, but they're just gonna promote the negative.
I just wish it all stopped.
They've destroyed billions in property. They've killed people. And they've never been held accountable as far as I can see.
Not good, not American.
I think there's lots of different people in this world who claim to be a part of something. Everybody wants to be part of something. I think Antifa is one of those groups that is just radical.
I don't know, stuff in Portland doesn't seem very good. I don't know exactly who they are.
People going in disorder everywhere, so, I don't see very much of what is their motivation.
Antifa? No, sir, I have not heard of it.
Never heard of it.
I would like to keep my opinion private.
I think it's probably real, but I think it's a bit more built up in more of politics.
It's just a mindset being anti-fascist.
I would support that general idea. However, I also think that there are some, violent aspects that have been associated with at least some fraction of people who maybe self-associate with that moniker that isn't great.
Because, I don't know much about it, for instance. I'm a college student, so it's kind of just focusing on school. And
there's a lot of weirdos out there. They have no common sense, no decency.
It's not a cohesive group. It's just a term that's used to identify people who are on the left.
They really hurt Republicans, with riots and stuff like that.
See them a lot on the news. I know they're associated with a lot of the riots and demonstrations and stuff that went on. You know, I don't believe a lot of what I see on TV.
All I know is I don't like them.
To me, what I've read is that they're lawless.
You can always try to solve things peacefully and not riot and tear people's stuff up, just to make a point.
California dreaming these days isn't about becoming warm and safe in LA, as the mamas and the papas sang about. It's about leaving LA and elsewhere in the state. Over the last 2 decades, California has seen a net loss of about 2.4 million people, or 7% of the 2,000 population. That's according to the Urban Reform Institute. And that doesn't even include the most recent COVID exodus. California also has the nation's highest poverty rate. So what's happening in the Golden State? Here to help us shed light on this question is Joel Kotkin. He's the Executive Director of the Urban Reform Institute and Presidential Fellow in Urban Futures at Chapman University, and the author of many books, including The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, A Warning to the Global Middle Class. Joel, welcome.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So could you start by helping us understand what some of the major factors are that are pushing people out of the promised land?
Well, I think there are several different things. One of the things is that we have imposed an energy policy, which makes California very, very expensive for anything that uses energy. And we're basically trying to get rid of natural gas. We're systematically destroying our own once very large oil industry. And so manufacturers certainly have to go elsewhere. We also, in our climate policy, have made the mistaken idea that the way to deal with climate is to force people to live in small apartments in urban areas, whereas the vast majority, even before COVID, wanted to live in a single-family house more in the suburbs. So what we've done is we've created the highest property prices in the country, one of the lowest home ownership rates. So what's happening is if you're a young family in California, unless you make a lot of money or you rob the bank or have rich parents, you're going to probably have to look to live either accept the fact that you're going to live in an apartment, you're probably never going to own anything, probably not going to have kids, or you go somewhere else. And that's where we're losing so many people, which I think does not bode well. I'm frankly more worried not about the people leaving, but the people who aren't coming. When I came to California in 1971, everybody was from somewhere else. The idea that you would leave California to go anywhere else was beyond the pale. Nobody ever talked that way. And now we have this massive amount of people who are leaving, but also fewer people coming.
I understand. So there's a lot of factors there, a lot of things to unpack. One of the interesting things you're talking about is the affordability of housing. I saw a stat that something like only in San Jose, only 2% of homes would be affordable to a teacher. That seems incredible to me. What is the role of home ownership? Why is that so important, do you think?
Well, home ownership is really how the middle class makes money. I mean, that's basically what it boils down to. And so if you can't own a home, you're always going to be, at the mercy of your landlord. You won't have anything to rely on. How many people, particularly of the older generation, have been able to use their homes as ways to, have a sort of extra savings that maybe if they do want to move or they want to downsize, they have something to sell. If you're a renter, you really don't have anything. What are you going to do? Live on Social Security? We don't get pensions anymore very much. So one of the things that we're finding is that this is something, a study I'm working on right now, at what we're seeing is that foreign-born people who had been swelling in huge numbers in California the last 20, 30 years, immigrants attracted by opportunity, now they're going elsewhere. The LA is actually seeing a bit of a drop in its foreign-born population. And where are they going? They're going to Dallas, they're going to Nashville, they're going to Fayetteville, Arkansas, they're going to all sorts of places that traditionally your Asian Latino immigrants, who are the vast majority, would not have gone to before, but they're now going to those other cities. And so when you look at the great rise of California in the latter part of the 20th century, a lot of it was driven by both domestic migration and foreign immigration. Both of those have dropped.
So you've, in your book, coined or identified something called neo-feudalism, and I assume it has to do with this idea that there's, we have the highest poverty rates in California. There's also the very wealthy are doing fine there. Can you explain what's going on?
Well, part of what we've done in California is, and this ties to what I was saying earlier about energy and regulatory policy, we've created a situation where the only businesses that really are doing very well in California have been, up until recently, high-end real estate and the tech companies. And so what we've done in California is our legislature thinks, well, we'll just have another IPO, another more capital gains that will be made at the very high end, and that will bring money into the government. What we don't realize is we're not creating any middle-class jobs. So what we've got is a bifurcated economy. Over 80% of all the jobs created in California in the last decade paid under the median income, and half of those paid under $40,000 a year. So what we do is we create some incredible wealth. The greatest creation of wealth probably in the world is now taking place in California. At the same time, the average Californian is doing less well, and the gap between the middle class and the upper class is now higher in California than virtually any place in the country. We have a inequality level similar to Mexico.
Oh, wow. That's remarkable to hear. But even some of the the tech companies have been leaving California too. We know Oracle left, Elon Musk left, Hewlett-Packard left, and other sorts of, higher end businesses. So why are they leaving?
Well, I think what's happening is that the oppressiveness of the tax regime, the oppressiveness of the regulatory regime is even getting to those companies maybe more mature. They've been around for a while. HP, of course, is one of the foundational companies of Silicon Valley. We're now hearing that Disney is considering moving many of its employees to Florida. We've seen major companies that are higher end companies, McKesson, certainly many of the Toyota, Nissan. These companies have been moving out, and it's the same basic thing. If you're an IPO in San Francisco and you're a bunch of people in their 20s and a group of people making a fortune, it's okay. But if you're a company that isn't going to have an IPO, you're not going to have this huge burst of money, how are you going to employ people? How are you going to recruit a young family from Michigan and expect them to pay 2-3 times as much for a house and have a huge part of their income taxed away? So what's literally happening is that we're seeing the movement out now of a tier of companies, Bechtel, Parsons, some of the major companies, engineering companies, they're leaving too. And some of the more mature companies, some are leaving completely, like Oracle moving their headquarters, HP moving their headquarters. And then there are other ones who say, oh, we're going to keep our headquarters in California. Why would I give up my house in Newport Beach? But, all my new jobs are going to be someplace else. So who gets screwed? The middle class and the working class. And so this is what creates a feudal society where there's less home ownership, less dispersion of property, an extreme wealthy class, which really dominates everything. And everybody else is if they were middle class before, are on their way to becoming serfs.
So obviously these dynamics have been at work for a while, but a lot of people in California are not happy with Governor Gavin Newsom. So how much do you think his policies are at fault or negligent, things he could have done, could have helped things?
Well, unfortunately, Newsom really is just basically following whatever the party line is. I don't think he's particularly interested in the sort of philosophical side, like former Governor Brown, who had his good points and his bad points, but was somebody who was fairly consistent in what he was saying. Newsom's lockdown policies, the closing of outdoor dining was really a very bad move. There was no justification for it. It caused huge problems. By the way, very often immigrants who own these restaurants, if you go to restaurants in California, you'll find immigrants are pretty prominent in that. He of course got caught having a fancy meal, non-socially distanced at the French Laundry restaurant in Napa. So he's obviously got he's got a PR problem. The big problem getting rid of Newsom, I think, will be that the people who would have voted against Newsom are leaving every day. Older people, older affluent people, middle-class people, young families. If you're young and ambitious and you want to buy a house and raise a family, and you may not like a dysfunctional education system and high taxes, you leave. So who stays are predominantly the core constituencies behind Gavin Newsom. So I can't see him really being replaced unless the Republican Party has a badly needed brain transplant. In other words, if they start coming up with candidates who can appeal to younger people, who can appeal to Latinos and African Americans and Asians. On the local level, they've done it. But on the statewide level, if you run another, old white guy from another state who's going to mouth off conservative slogans, he's not going to win. A transformative candidate, if you will, somebody who had some of the magic that Reagan had, or somebody who maybe from a female or somebody from a minority background, maybe you'd have a chance. But if the Republican Party keeps running, milquetoast, standard brand conservatives, there's no hope.
All right, well, it'll certainly be interesting to see how things play out. And in our next segment, we'll be talking a bit more about the recall, so we'll dig into it more. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, and coming up after the break, California Governor Gavin Newsom, he faces his biggest political test. Will the recall go through? We'll find out. But first, here's America Q&A.
It says it clearly in the Constitution that you can't impeach somebody that's not in office. That's the whole process of impeaching.
Yes, I think he ought to be impeached.
Yeah, I think that's part of the constitutional abilities to be able to do that.
He's already out, so what is the point? Right? We're still that's just keeping the nation divided by still attacking him and going after him. We did what half the people wanted to do, right? Was get him out, so he's out.
I think they're beating a dead horse.
My thought on that is if a person is not in position of power no more, why impeach him?
Let's say it's over, let it go, just let's move forward.
At first I didn't, but then you saw the things that would happen, that would get taken away from the president if he did get impeached. And so I think it's important to think if there's a reason to do it.
It's all about accountability. Nobody's above the law regardless of their job. So yes, in my book, it's fine.
What it represents is, setting a precedent for people that come after.
I think, since he already left, I think you shouldn't do it at all.
Not really. It's not going to do any good to us personally as a nation.
Yeah, that's like anything else. You break the law, regardless of when it's done, you gotta pay the penalty.
I think it just depends on the the relevancy of what they did, because if you did something, you should be punished if you did something pretty bad.
For the average person like myself who was so against Trump, to me it doesn't matter. At this point, he's out of office. That was more important than the impeachment.
I would like to make it specific and say that this ex-president Donald Trump absolutely deserves to be impeached because he incited an insurrection at the Capitol.
No, I don't think it's fair.
It doesn't really make sense. For me, who I'm not into politics, I wouldn't care to make so much mess over that.
If the crimes were committed during the time of office, it's probably still worth it to go through with the impeachment.
It's just funny now. It's a comedy. So I think the first time was enough. I think the second time was just for publicity and more propaganda.
Got to be answerable for your crime. I don't care whether you're in office or not.
No, it's a little vindictive.
Any of this doesn't make sense to me at all.
Trends may be fleeting, but values are timeless. We now bring you this new clothing brand with classic design and luxurious comfort. It's our way of sharing hope and inspiration from the world of Shenyun. We bring you Shenyun Dancer. Wear it with honor.
So clearly, there are a lot of Californians unhappy with their state, and as we just heard, they're voting with their feet. Others are laying the blame at the feet of Governor Gavin Newsom. Of course, it didn't start with Newsom, but there is a growing number of Californians who feel they might be better off without him. The recall effort started as a loosely organized grassroots movement, but it's gaining steam. And we're joined now by Anne Hyde. She's the campaign manager and finance director for Rescue California. Anne, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so can you start by telling us where things are at with the campaign, actually? I know you need to get 1.5 million signatures, is that right, in order to trigger the recall election? So where are things at, and how much longer is there to go?
So that 1.5 million is actually the number of signatures that are needed to be valid signatures. So you always want to plan for a buffer, and usually that's determined by your validity rate as you turn in the signatures to the county registrars. Our validity rate, according to the Secretary of State's website, is about 84%, which is great. That would really require us to get about 1.8 million signatures in order to guarantee a 1.5 million signature target.
Okay, so we'll talk more about the campaign and where things are going in a minute, but maybe you can just lay out for us, what are the main grievances against Governor Gavin Newsom?
Well, I think it started quite some time ago with basic mismanagement issues, bills that had been signed that really went against the very grain of California and its citizens, and really made people wonder whether or not he was really in touch with what California citizens need in order to survive. And let's start with having the highest tax rate. Let's start with being at the top of the list of states with serious homeless issues, as well as jobless rates. So today, as we speak, we are number one on almost all those lists, and we're also pretty close to number one on the list of the worst states rolling out the COVID vaccines. So then you start mixing into that the things that happened since the beginning of the movement, and there have been 3 efforts. This is the 3rd one, and clearly the most successful one. However, a lot of the volunteers served on the 2 previous ones. I think the turning point, though, was really the French Laundry scandal, and watching him be hypocritical about, no more than 2 households should be having Thanksgiving together, and oh, by the way, put your mask on in between bites, and then all of a sudden there's a picture of him shoulder to shoulder, no masks at the French Laundry. He lied about it being outside. He got caught. He got caught, and that was really when everybody turned from, okay, he's hypocritical, now he's not to be trusted. So that, I hope that answers your question, but that's pretty much, there's so many things that you could point to that have made people upset. For me, it was seeing surfers with Recall Gavin Newsom on their boards at the Huntington Beach Pier. I mean, that's where I just went, oh, he's in trouble. Then he closed the parks, then he closed the beaches and the parks, and I think it's been downhill since then.
So you need 1.5 million signatures, but in the recall election, to actually recall him, you need a majority. So how are you feeling about the prospects of that? I just saw a recent Public Policy Institute of California poll, which has him polling very poorly among Republicans, just 15% approval, but among Democrats at 75% approval.
Well, I think you have to, there was been a number of polls, and you have to look at the push questions. You know, his approval ratings have tanked. That's the media's label for it, or plummet was another word that was used for his decline, rapid decline, off a cliff decline in his approval ratings. So I think he's sort of Gray Davis on steroids, and he's his own worst enemy, and he's our biggest asset. There isn't a week that goes by.
So Gray Davis, that was the only other successful recall campaign. I believe there's been ones initiated basically against every governor in California since 1960. Is that right?
Oh, probably even before then. It's been around for that. Lemon Law has been around for a long time.
Okay, so Gray Davis was in fact recalled. I was looking up the numbers there. It looked like his disapproval rating was around 75% across the board. So that recall went through, and actually Arnold Schwarzenegger became governor as a result of that. So when you look at that campaign and what you've got going now, what are you seeing?
Well, I saw that as a very partisan situation. I see this as a citizen movement. We just got, we're attracting interest all across the board. And if you dig down into those polls, I think the more dangerous numbers are that the no party preference category of voters, he's upside down there too. His disapproval is higher than his approval. That's a big uh-oh. So you've gone from a situation, like I think 30% of the electorate is no party preference. That's the group that you really have to worry about. That's the group he really has to worry about. The other demographic that is vastly different than it was in 2003 was the impact of the soccer moms. And I might say they're not soccer moms anymore because sports aren't allowed to be played. So now they're just mad moms. It's a baby boomer demographic as well. And that's the largest demographic in U.S. history, and certainly a large demographic here. The retired community is also something I think, and that's part of the baby boomer demographic as well. So I think there's a lot that's changed since 2003. I think anybody who looks at 2003 and tries to draw parallels, you're going to find that as you dig down, it's apples and oranges. I think he's absolutely betrayed the trust of his electorate. I don't even think he knows what they need. I don't think he understands why they're so angry. His response is very political. It's not policy driven, and the policies he comes up with seem to be driven by politics. So it's not planned policy. It's strictly a political response, evidenced by the $2 billion that he threw on the table a week after Willie Brown suggested that if he fixed the education problem, he would be able to withstand a recall. And now we come to find that he didn't even confer with his own team of the teachers union, the administrators, and so forth. This is not the solution they were looking for, and he never even worked with them on that. So I think he's alienating his own base. I think there's a number of unions that are not pleased with him too, but at any rate, it's a completely different playing field now than it was back in 2003.
So if the signature campaign is successful and there's going to be an election, what's the time frame between those two parts?
Yeah, it's complicated. So we turn them in, say our turn-in deadline is March 17th. We should and will turn them in at least a week prior, if not before. And then I think by late June, after it runs through a number of different back and forth between the registrar and the Secretary of State, and then some legislative committees, the lieutenant governor is obligated to call the election, set a date, and we're guessing that's going to be in late June, and that the election date will be sometime in late August, middle of September. And ironically, and the fun part about all of this is that of course, bill signing starts, or bills are presented to the governor for signing right about the time this is all happening. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not there continues to be this distancing that his own party members are starting to take from him on policy. You saw that very early on with Cotty Petrie Norris, who represents the Huntington Beach area, who disagreed with him on what I think is going to go down as being the actual thing that tumbles this governor, is going to be the Employment Development Department scandal of a loss of $31 billion in jobless COVID benefits. And that number seems to be climbing. It's amazing to me. I mean, that's 3 times, it's 10% of this state budget, and it's 3 times what we spend on corrections and rehabilitation. It's a crazy number. And he hasn't commented on it. He hasn't even taken any punitive measures on it. Nobody's lost their job over it. And he hasn't even commented on it at all. So I predict that's going to be one of the biggest things he's going to have to defend. I don't know how he can.
And so who gets to run in that election?
Anybody, you can run. I'm not running. But last time, if you recall, and I'm sure you've seen, there was about 135 people that jumped up and decided to run. And it wasn't all just Arnold Schwarzenegger. We had some really impressive people on the ballot. We had Dick Reardon, who was mayor of Los Angeles. We had Peter Ueberroth, an iconic businessman and baseball commissioner and chairman of the '84 Olympics. We had Congressman Darrell Issa on the ballot when Arnold got in the night before. So again, there were, I probably want to say there was 6 to 10 pretty good options on the Republican side. And then the Democrats have a very awkward situation. Cruz Bustamante actually ended up filing at the last minute. And then I don't think he had a political career after that. And he had to kind of run on the, okay, I'm not against Gray Davis, but should you be against Gray Davis, go ahead and check my box as the replacement. So there's 2 things on the ballot: the recall, thumbs up, thumbs down, and a replacement. Pick one. And that person who gets the most votes is going to be governor within 7 to 10 days.
Wow, that's a very tight time frame. So what are you seeing on the Democrat side in terms of interest in throwing hat in the ring?
You know, I think as we get closer to the turn-in number that we need, more and more people are going to jump in. And judging from the number of Democrats that are publicly upset with him, I think you're going to see possibly some businessmen, past elected officials, and any number of people could be getting in. So the more vulnerable he looks, you might even see the Democrat Party get into a little bit of damage mitigation themselves and making sure that there's somebody on the ballot that can win.
I mean, that would seem to me the crux of it for them. What are they signaling? Yeah. Are we signaling that we have support behind Gavin Newsom, or we don't?
Well, I don't get Democrat signals from where I sit, but I can tell you with my ear to the ground that seems to be building. There seems to be a much louder murmur, if you will. It's turning into a chatter, and you're actually starting to see speculation in the media on who some of the other Democrats might be. You might also start seeing some people running as an independent. I think California is, by definition, independent, and you could see some very credible people get in that category of voter.
And what about on the Republican side? Who have you got up?
Well, it's a funny year. Anybody in public office can run for this seat and not lose the seat that they're currently in because it's off cycle. So they could run for 60 days because that's going to be about what it is. They can run for 60 days, and if they win, they're going to be governor. If they lose, they keep their day job. So anything's possible. I think you're going to see a pretty healthy bunch. And the more he keeps disenfranchising himself from the citizens of this state in a bipartisan, nonpartisan fashion, I think the numbers are going to grow on either side of the aisle and possibly in the middle.
All right, we're going to have to wrap up, but are you seeing signs that he is concerned about this?
Yes.
What are those signs?
Well, that, originally we were clearly getting under his skin and getting some reports back that it was an annoyance. Now I think what you're starting to see is that he's making political choices. I mean, I see a lot of direct mail positioning right now in the things that he's doing And you know, I don't think he would have come up with the $2 billion and thrown it in without any consideration to the mix had we not been here. I honestly don't think he would have reopened with no apparent reason, and certainly with no basis in numbers, had it not been for the recall. I think he's seeing the same polling numbers we're seeing, and that he's starting to trend dangerously on a very steep downward curve. Otherwise, you wouldn't be seeing him do these things that make no sense.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Anne. Thank you for joining us and explaining all of that.
Well, thank you for having me.
And that's all for today's show. Thank you so much for joining The Nation Speaks. And watch us every Saturday, 11 a.m. to noon Eastern. And from all of us here, have a great week.
Hi, we're happy to announce that you can also catch us on cable TV now. Millions of households already choose us as one of their trusted news sources, and you can too. You can watch us in Chicago, Washington, D.C., New York, and many other cities as well. And if your system doesn't carry NTD yet, you can just give them a quick call and request NTD on your cable provider. Thank you for watching. See you next time.